Okay. So any other questions about any other things? Anywhere? 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 Yes? Going once? Going twice? 3 times sold. I have been fascinated in the last few weeks now. I think this launched maybe 3 weeks ago. Actually, I got it right here, August 13th. August 13th. So that is just over 2 weeks, going on 3 weeks. Yeah, it is going on 3 weeks. This news story, and now I'm going to toggle out. Oh yeah, someone just hit me up about China and India de-escalating their border tension. I almost chose that for today, but I figured this story was getting a little old already, so I should jump into this because it has big repercussions for what's going on in politics in multiple countries right this moment, including this one, the United States of America. So I'm now going to toggle between 2 different presentations, and anytime you need to see my wonderful face bigger, you can just hit me up in the chat room and say, more Boyer, less screen, but I think you're going to want more screen. So the news in review story of my selection for the last 3 weeks running that I'm just now getting to is this whole thing about the UAE recognizes Israel as an independent sovereign state via a presidential peace treaty brokered by U.S. President Donald Trump, or at least Donald Trump's team. Maybe he did it personally. That seems unlikely. And a lot of questions get raised by this, I think, in the United States, because I assume, probably correctly, that 95% of Americans have no idea what the hell that even means. Who? What? A country recognizes another country, and a third country, the United States, had something to do with it. Okay, what the hell's that all about? And why is it happening right this second? And why is this strategically happening exactly a couple months before a U.S. election and exactly a couple months before an Israeli election? Isn't that a huge coincidence? No, there are no coincidences in international politics. So this is the big story. August 13th, it was announced out of the blue. I'm a world watcher, and I had not heard any whisperings of anything happening behind the scenes, much less a really big announcement about the United Arab Emirates, that's what the UAE stands for, if you don't know, officially recognizing this state called Israel. See, now, okay, this isn't working already. Maybe, okay, there you got it. Another story with the players involved. Israel and the UAE make public their quiet affair. Those of us that do watch the world understand that there are some states that have had not full diplomatic relations with Israel, but have had covert diplomatic relations with Israel. So we already knew that the UAE was not officially recognizing Israel, but had, over the course of the last years and decades, some strategic ties in terms of economic stuff, technology stuff, and a lot of information sharing was going on between the two states. And the folks you're seeing here are the leader of the UAE, Donald Trump, the leader of the United States, of course, and if you don't know him already, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. Prime Minister Benny, old Uncle Benny. Now, some other things that have popped up, and I just randomly went and pulled news stories to prepare for this. UAE recognizes Israel, which will stop annexation in Trump-brokered deal. Okay, annexation? What? You read into the story, Israel and the United Arab Emirates reached a historic peace deal. Full normalization of diplomatic relations between the two Middle Eastern nations. Under this agreement, Israel has agreed to suspend applying sovereignty to the areas of the West Bank, therefore stopping annexation. Okay, what's that all about? What's annexation? What's the West Bank? Who are the Palestinians? And that's the other news story that I pulled. The Arab League rejects, and this is just from a couple days ago, the Arab League rejects a Palestinian demand to officially condemn this Israeli UAE historic peace deal that was brokered by Donald Trump. And this is President Mahmoud Abbas, the leader, the prime minister, I guess, of the Palestinians in the West Bank. There's a West Bank of Palestine. There is a Gaza Strip of Palestine. These are all terms that I'm assuming many of you have never heard of before. Or if you've heard of them, you've heard of them in passing. And so you're like, The funny thing about all of this is recognition, annexation, Palestine. Maybe you've heard of a two-state solution. The Arab League denying the Palestinians. And some of this has got to do with Iran. What are all these terms, and how on God's green earth was Donald Trump somehow involved in the middle of all this? The strange thing about Israel and Palestine and Middle East relations in general, but specifically the story of Israel and how all of this has come to pass, is not really talked about that much in the United States. You might know this if you're an American who's had at least some schooling. You kind of understand, or you kind of recognize, that the United States and Israel are really strong allies. But you probably don't know why. And you may have an inclination that a lot of states around the state of Israel don't like Israel, and they don't have diplomatic ties. But you might not understand, well, what the hell's that it's all about either. At no point in the American education system, at least not for me and most of the students I've had over 22 or 23 years, at any given point in middle school or high school or even other college classes, was this whole Palestinian-Israeli situation even brought up. And that's because it's quite sensitive to all the players involved, super sensitive, one might say. It causes political polarization. So if you come out on one side of this argument or the other, the people on the other side hate your guts and will attack you. If you come on the other side, another group of people will hate you and attack you for your views. So there's pro-Palestinian viewpoints, and there's pro-Israeli viewpoints, and there's really no middle ground between them, which is why a lot of instructors, professors, teacher types kind of don't ever want to touch this issue for fear of offending anyone, because it is a political hot button issue that can get you into some hot water. So therefore, why am I talking about it? Because I love hot water. I'm going to try to present a historical timeline here and fill you in on some of these terms in about as a neutral fashion as I can. You may already, if you're adamant about one viewpoint or the other in this dispute, this Arab-Israeli dispute, you will already have formulated opinions by something I've said already, that you're like, oh, he's anti-Arab, or he's anti-Semitic, or he's anti-Israel, or he's anti-that, and he's a horrible person. And hey, I'm just telling you straight up, I'm going to try to do this as neutral and diplomatically as possible, simply so you understand more about the terms and why this news story is kind of a big deal. And by the way, it is kind of a big deal. It's not getting a whole lot of play in the American press, even though Donald Trump would really love it to, because perhaps the press is jaded against Donald Trump. That's certainly what Donald Trump and, say, conservative America thinks, that the press won't give him any credit for this. I would say there's a modicum of truth to that. The other part of it is, again, most Americans don't understand any of this. So for this story to have broke just a couple months before the U.S. election, it was certainly intentional. It was definitely calculated. They wanted this peace treaty to come out publicly so that it puts the feather in a cap of Donald Trump's foreign policy, so that he has a win, so he can say, look how successful a broker I am, and that this is going to have long-term repercussions and impacts for this region, and I brokered this deal, and it's a very big deal. Look how smart I am. Unfortunately for him, again, most people were like, okay. Most Americans don't pay attention to too much foreign policy. And in this case in particular, not that many Americans are well educated about Middle Eastern policy or the creation of the State of Israel, how all this came to pass. So an interesting time for this story to have come out, and it does have big repercussions. And quite frankly, don't judge. I'm a neutral observer of these events. It is kind of a feather in the cap of Donald Trump, and it is not being wildly talked about or speculated about in the U.S. press. It's getting much more play in Middle Eastern press because it's such a big deal, but not so much in the American press for all of the reasons that I just talked about. Okay, so let's start with some of the terms. And by the way, I would try to keep the chat box open right in front of me. So if you have a question, and I'll try to pay attention to Facebook chat too, although I can never see questions over there. Well, I can see the little window of myself playing, but I can't see. Oh, I see it now. Okay. There is a question in the middle. Okay. Voet Seki 1 says, okay, which side are you on if there's no middle ground? I hope I already explained it. I am a dispassionate, neutral observer for this lecture. If you want to buy me a round of Lebanese wine sometime, I can give you my personal inclinations and professors, or will profess more on my opinions about things. But since this is an academic exercise, and it's mostly about you being educated and understanding the issues more, I will, again, attempt to be as neutral as possible. Even just simply stating facts will piss some people off, because they'll say, I don't like those facts. And we live in an era now where people think, well, my opinion is fact, and I only want to hear the facts that I already agree with. So I know I'm going to offend some, just be prepared for it. But everything I'm telling you is a case of historical fact, not a debate, and not a personal opinion on my part. Okay. And Kat already jumped in. Cat Minecrafter said they'll buy me some special German wine. Wow. All right. Cool. I'm all about a nice Spätlese. Cat Minecrafter, anytime you're ready to pour that in my glass. Okay, let's get to some of the terms. And again, I will try to keep my eyes peeled, and Katie will alert me if questions pop up. Please ask questions along the way. And for you Facebook viewers, if you want to see all the graphics, then go to the Twitch information that Katie will put into the chat right now so you can see all the graphics that I'm explaining to my Twitch audience. Twitch is awesome, by the way. I love this. Whoever Twitchy people are out there, I love you for creating this platform. So let's start with some of the easiest words that you recognize, like the word recognize. See, I love doing this shit. So what do we mean when we say the UAE just recognized Israel? Was Israel invisible to people who live in the UAE? Could they not see it? Did it magically appear? No. All states and all humans who have ever looked at a map or visited the Middle East know there is this place called Israel. When we're talking of recognition, we're saying that a state, a sovereign state, you know what that is, I hope, after this week's lectures, a sovereign state recognizes the sovereignty of another state. The government of this entity recognizes the government of your entity as a rightful group of humans that rule over this territory, a defined territory. That's what sovereignty is all about. It's the quid pro quo. I recognize your state, you recognize my state, we all recognize each other. And therefore we have a diplomatic relations. We set up embassies in each other's countries. We have economic interplay, technological interplay. We have open communications and travel between our countries. Well, not right now because of COVID. But you know what I'm saying. That is normal diplomatic relations that you would have with that most sovereign states have with all the other sovereign states. So who doesn't recognize Israel in the full diplomatic sense of recognition? This map right here is telling you exactly who recognizes the state of Israel and who does not. If you want to get real close to your screen and read the legend, the dark blue or the, 100 and or so countries. In fact, I think I have some text here. There it is. 162 of the 193 sovereign states who are members of the United Nations recognize the state of Israel. Fully recognize, diplomatic relations are set, and for most of these states, they have been for a very long time. Oh, someone's saying about there's mic noises?
That's just me.
Okay. Am I speaking too loudly?
No, it's when you hit the table. It
Oh, yeah, I do tend to bang on shit.
Yeah.
You really should see me live sometime. Let's just do live COVID style. I'll get up in a tree and lecture to a group of humans like Moses on the Mount. And strangely enough, that will come up in this presentation very soon. The 162 sovereign states of the world that recognize Israel pretty much have since 1947. The lion's share of those would have recognized their sovereignty back when Israel declared it in 1947, 1948. We'll get to that in a minute too. However, there are 31 states, UN members, that do not recognize, diplomatically or otherwise, the existence or the right of existence of the state of Israel and or the government of the state of Israel. These include 19, and here we get into some more terms already. 19 of those 31 are 19 of the 22 members of the Arab League. Okay, already we have a new word. We've got a new phrase. So the vast majority of some entity called the Arab League does not recognize the state of Israel. Okay, put a pin in that. And you can see most of those states are in the Middle East. Most of the 31 states that do not recognize Israel are all around Israel in the Middle East. And that brings us to, okay, what's this entity that the majority does not recognize? It is called the Arab League. What is the Arab League? It's lit up for you here. These are states whose dominant ethnicity, it's an ethnic group, is ethnically Arab. The ethnic group called Arab does dominate most of the Middle East, but not all. We'll get to that in a sec. And these folks got together and created an international institution back in the 70s, I believe. That's not important for the quiz because you'll be quizzed on Arab League maybe next week or week after. So the Arab League got together based upon their common culture, history, language, and heritage, and formed this international cooperative group that honestly, by and large, hasn't been that effective. So a lot of other groups like NATO, super effective group. Even the WTO, yeah, they're effective. They do lots of trade negotiations. NAFTA, before Donald Trump changed the name of it, it increased trade between three countries. So lots of international organizations are quite effective at what they do. But the Arab League got together back in the 70s to try to sort out, work together economically, politically, to promote not just the culture, but ties between the states, and to find solutions for Arab problems, for Arab state problems. They have, by any measure, not done a lot. It's not one of the more successful international coalitions. However, it still exists, and actually they just formed up a joint army, I think, like 5 years ago. I remember reporting a story on it in class that all 22 states had sat down and said, hey, we want to have kind of a ready reserve emergency force between all of us of an Arab army of, say, 40 or 60,000 soldiers. I'm not sure where that's at right now, but I'm putting it out there. I don't want to diminish the Arab League totally and say it was completely worthless, but they have not been a particularly successful institute that has solved Arab problems or really pushed Arab societies, say like poverty issues. They've not been that successful at alleviating things like that nature, or even working together economically that well. But it is the Arab League, and the Arab League, by and large, does not recognize the state of Israel. Now, I do have to give you an ignorance alert. A lot of folks do. When they think of the Middle East, they're like, oh, well, the Middle East, I mean, everybody's Arab. Why are we pointing out the Arab League? They're all Arab. No. Most of the population of the Middle East and most of the sovereign states of the Middle East are dominated by the Arab ethnic group, but there are others of specific note for you to understand this story and understand the world at large. And one of the big glaring exceptions is, as you see on this map, the Hebrew group, which is in the state of Israel. They're not Arab. The folks that now constitute the majority of this place called Israel, they have Jewish or descent, speak Hebrew. Another big player is Turkey. Turkey is full of Turkish people, not Arab people. And the biggest one to think about, oh, by the way, there's also the Berbers. The Berbers, the main ethnic group of Morocco. But the main one I want you to think about and remember for the rest of your life, whether you're in this class or not, if you want to understand how the world works, especially in the Middle East, you have to see this big glaring exception over here in this country called Iran. And Iran is ethnically Persian. They are not ethnically Arab. And that is a very big deal to understanding why the UAE, by the way, back to point, may have just recognized the state of Israel. So I am already confusing you, perhaps. What's ethnicity got to do with it? I'm going to go ahead and plant the seed now for you to keep in your head. Most Arab states have not recognized Israel. Also, most Arab states don't like Iran. Most Arab governments, I can't speak for all the peoples of each of these countries, most Arab governments do not like the Persian Iranian government. So already, we're talking about Israel, but already we have a side issue that you need to have in your brain because it's a big deal of perhaps why this is going down right now with the UAE recognizing Israel. You all with me so far? Here's something else to consider. Of the Arab League that I've already now told you does not particularly work that great together or have achieved a whole lot together, there are subsets of it that actually have strategically done a bit more as smaller, tighter units. And the tighter unit I want you to know about is called the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. This only formed up, I don't know, say 5 or 6 years ago. It's been floated by the king of Saudi Arabia a time or two that perhaps that all of these other states you see lit up in purple here, and the GCC is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman. Hey, UAE, that's what we're talking about. The GCC, as suggested by the kings of Saudi Arabia a time or two, is that, you know, we all should just morph into one giant super state called Saudi Arabia and Friends. In other words, it's been suggested we should just dissolve all the sovereignty national borders and just be one entity. Some places I think have debated about this, but others, including the UAE, have said, oh, hell no. We're part of the GCC, but we're not ready for full incorporation into Saudi Arabia and Friends just quite yet. But I did want to point this out, that this is a group that does a lot more interaction on a political and economic and information sharing level. So the Arab League is this one big thing that spans from Morocco all the way over to Iraq, and that's huge. This is an entity that is more related by blood. They're dominantly Arab ethnicities, but they also are part of the kind of greater kingdom. So there's royal families. Almost all these places are monarchies. In fact, I believe they all are. So there's also this relation that they have the same governing styles, and they may even have family royal ties between them. So it's a much tighter institute, okay? If that makes sense. So far, so good? I hope so. I'm planting the seed of this because when we're thinking about the repercussions of the UAE recognizing Israel, I want you to be thinking about the GCC already as who else might now recognize Israel? Think about the GCC first, all right? Seed planted, we'll come back to that, okay? Now, this big map I showed you of recognition, who's recognizing Israel and who's not recognizing Israel. Okay, 19 members of the Arab League do not recognize. But I said there was like 31 or 32 or so that don't recognize. So who are the others? A further 9 non-recognizers are members of something called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That's not one that I'll have you remember for a quiz, by the way. It's more important that you just understand the keyword here, Islamic. So there's 9 other countries who are part of a group that's Islamic that also don't recognize Israel. Okay, what's one got to do with the other? Because we often also think of the Middle East as this place that Islam was born and that everyone in the Middle East is Muslim, a follower of Islam. And again, that is generally speaking true, but with some exceptions. Saudi Arabia, member of the GCC, was the birthplace of this major world religion back in the 600s, 700s AD. And it expanded from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, as you see here in this map, to all kind of classic places we consider parts of the Middle East, except maybe not Spain and Portugal. but it emanated out from the Arabian Peninsula to other places. And indeed, I always refer to it as the peak of the Arab slash Islamic Empire. You don't see that too often, but at one point, after kind of unification of the religion in the Saudi Arabia and surrounding areas, the core, it was a very successful political group that then expanded Islam under a political dynasty. So it's religious based, but it's also a political entity that would have had recognized borders and a government and interaction between them. The Islamic Caliphate. Consider it like a state back in the years early 600s into the 700s AD. Now this same, they spread the religion, okay? And as the Islamic Caliphate faded away, as dynasties and kingdoms and empires do, it was replaced by this entity called the Ottoman Empire. Now we're getting much more into modern times, a mere 1300 AD. After the one entity goes away that was Arab-based, by the way, that was the Arab political dynasty, they go away and the Turkish Ottoman Empire takes over and roughly controls what we call the classic Middle East, but they were also pushing into Austria and Europe proper at the height of their power. But Ottomans are Turks. We're already back to some of those other ethnic groups in the Middle East, the Turks. They're not Arab, they're not Persian either. So the religion was carried onwards for several hundred more years by the Ottoman Empire in this whole region we call the Middle East. But I also want you to understand that their religion went much further afield, including half of the globe. So when you start to step back and look at the map of majority Islamic countries in today's world, via circuitous routes, the religion was spread all the way down the west coast of Africa, all the way into Central Asia, through large swaths of what's now Pakistan, India, all the way over to Indonesia, Southeast Asia. So this is not a single empire. This is now just looking at where the majority of Muslims are on planet Earth. And it is a very, very wide swath with hundreds of millions of folks following this faith that are not in what we now consider the classic Middle East. In fact, feels like a test question. While Islam is from the Middle East, specifically the modern-day state of Saudi Arabia, the majority of Muslims are not living in the Middle East now. In fact, what's the most populous Muslim state? And the answer is on your map here. It's Indonesia. Okay, what's the next most populous Muslim state? Well, that would be India. Okay, what's the next most populous Muslim state? Well, that would be Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. So the top 4 or 5 biggest populations of Islamic people on planet Earth are not in the Middle East. Granted, most of the Middle East is Islamic, but it's not where the majority of Islamic folks are anymore. Okay, back to the map. Do you have a question?
I have a quick question about what Shia and Sunni means. What's the coloring difference? But I'm not sure if I want to hit on that right now.
How about we cover that next week or in a separate lecture, because I'm glad somebody just asked the question, what's the different colors in the maps here with Sunni versus Shia? These are major sects or divisions of the religion Islam. It's not political, the religion. Much the same way with Christianity, you have Catholicism, and then there was a branch off, and there's Protestantism. So much like Christianity, there was a division early on in Islamic thought and who followed which political / religious leader. And in today's world, that's manifested into 2 major divisions between Shia and Sunni. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I do want you to look at the map and understand, hey, where are most of the Shias at? The dark green. Where are almost all the Shias on this map? They're in Iran. Wait a minute, Boyer, you've already pointed out that Iran has something to do with this UAE thing, and that maybe most Arab states don't like Iran. Boyer, does this map have something to do with it? It does. So you have, now we're setting the stage of, you have Arab-led, dominant Arab ethnic led governments in big parts of the Middle East, and Iran is Persian ethnicity, so there's a difference. And add to that, they're all Muslim, but most Arab states are Sunni Muslim, and Iran is Shia Muslim. So now we have another division. And these divisions are important because this is why there's a lot of friction, or parts of the reason why there's a lot of friction between Iran and other Arab states and other states in the Middle East in general, including Israel. Cool? Back to point. This is why, when we look at this map now, it's like, oh, now I get why most of the Middle East perhaps doesn't recognize, or I now understand who in the Middle East doesn't recognize Israel, and why that other entities as far afield as Indonesia and Pakistan don't recognize the state of Israel. Maybe you don't understand why. That's coming up in a sec. But now you at least understand the map of, oh, okay, it's got something to do with ethnicity. It's got something to do with regionality. It's got something to do with Islamism, right? A world religion. Okay, so how did we get to the point of a bunch of countries in the Middle Eastern hood not recognizing one of their neighbors that they share borders with as an actual sovereign state? And when we start to explain, and this is the stuff that no one ever covers in American education, people just don't want to talk about the evolution and creation of the modern state of Israel because it hits too many religious and political buttons that people start calling you names if they don't like what you say. I'm willing to risk that with you great folks here on Twitch and on Facebook. I'm sure a lot of the Facebook viewers probably already heard this lecture in a class that I've given on the Middle East. So what is it about this particular thing that's so sensitive? I actually call it and many others too, that this particular single issue, the Arab-Israeli dispute, is perhaps the mother of all clashes within the Middle East. And there's lots of clashes in the Middle East. Right this second, there's multiple civil wars and political dissent and some territorial issues and some religious frictions. And we can look at this one particular dispute as one of the kind of linchpins that ties a lot of the other things together. Again, I know perhaps I'm talking in circles a little bit, but everything you learn from this lecture, just about this one news story, will help you understand relationships within the Middle East. I want you to apply everything I'm talking about to understanding long-term relationships across the Middle East. Who likes who? Who hates who? Who will go to war with who, and who will they be allies with in that war? So a lot of it has to do with what I'm going to tell you right now. Okay, how do we have a 100% Jewish state? Although that's not even true. There are Arab folks and Islamic folks in the state of Israel. But for the sake of argument, how do we have a 100% Jewish state surrounded by 100% Islamic follower states? All of its neighbors and most of the region. How did this come to pass? Well, I've already pointed out the growth of Islam just a little bit. But before Islam, in fact, a few thousand years before the birth of the religion we refer to as Islam, there was this other religion that started up. Actually, a couple, but we're going all the way back to the first one. With this dude named Moses and a bunch of people before him. And maybe you learned this stuff in Vacation Bible School. I don't know your religious background. I don't have that much religious background, but I love this image, by the way. Thou shalt be cool. Maybe you've heard of some of these things. The kingdom of Judea and Moses and the Jews were enslaved by the Egyptians and were building pyramids. And then Moses led his people out of and they crossed the Red Sea, parted the sea, and then on the mountain, he went to a mountain and got commandments. And this is our heritage and our birthplace. God gives the Jews this historic place called Israel. That's the promised land referred to in the Old Testament. And they go there and they live happily ever after, except, of course, they didn't. All right? So the evolution of Judaism, perhaps 2000 BC, perhaps 3000 BC. I'm not going to really test you on that, but it does predate other world religions. The one you're perhaps more familiar with in America is this thing called Christianity. It's easy to map out its dates. It's the year 0. That's why when Jesus is born, we restart the calendar, and it's the year 0. And that's when Jesus is there, and he starts an offshoot of Judaism called Christianity. More on that later if you'd like a whole lecture just on world religions. I haven't done it for a decade. Would love to do it in this class. Seems like a great time to go online and offend people left and right talking about world religions. But hell, I'll do it. So the Jews, led out of enslavement by the Egyptians by this dude called Moses, they go to their Lord, Yahweh, the one God, Yahweh, a monotheistic religion. He says, go to this place. He or she says, go to this place. It's your home. Have it. Let's call that the promised land of the 12 tribes. We're later going to call it Israel. Okay? Israel in biblical times was roughly, you look at these maps, you're like, oh, I kind of see it. That looks pretty close to the place on the map I can see today called Israel. And so they hung out there for, again, depending on the historians and how far back you want to place these historic dates. Maybe they lived there for 1,000 years. Maybe it was 2,000 years. Maybe it was longer than 2,000 years. That they had, like many other entities and empires around them, they had kingdoms rise and fall under different leaders, but it was the Jewish state, okay? Under David's kingdom, and then Solomon's kingdom, and the Hashemanian kingdom. There were many kingdoms, all right? It wasn't just like, oh yeah, we're calling it Israel and that's that. It grew and shrank with the times, but this is the core tenet of it. It is the place where everybody of this faith kind of hangs out. It's their historic homeland. Got it? Enter the Romans, who screw everything up. Because I don't want to get into a tremendous historical detail, because I'm already running out of time, and I've only got 500 slides to go. But when we start to point the finger of, okay, well, if there was this historic place called Israel that was around for 1 to 2 to 3,000 years, and now we're debating about recognizing it here in the 21st century, something must have happened in the middle, right? Where did Israel go? And if you want to start pointing fingers of why they had to go, it's the Romans. Because it's during the Roman Empire. There were empires before them. There was the Minoans, and, there was the Phoenicians, and there was the Egyptians, what's the Syrian? The Syrian ones that were super badass warriors. The Egyptians and the Hittites, they fought each other in this area. So, again, this isn't a nice story that there's just always been a kingdom of Israel. They were involved in fracases with their powerful neighbors in the past and lost territory and gained territory. It's not a nice, smooth, continuous story. And then when the Roman Empire crops up, and you can start tacking in dates like 100 BC to Jesus to 180 to 200 AD, in their heyday, okay, they take over all of the Eastern Mediterranean, including what's now the state of Israel. And because the Jews wouldn't surrender their religious beliefs and bow down to the Roman emperor, the Romans always had trouble with these uppity Jewish people in this little area of their kingdom. And many times had to send in troops to quash revolts, smash things, and actually had full-on Roman Judeo wars until they tired of that, and in the 1st century AD just fully ejected them. Came in, burnt the place to the ground, and said, get the hell out. We're going to either, if you stay here, we're going to kill you, and we don't want to kill you all, just get the hell out and go somewhere else. Thus starts this thing we call the Jewish diaspora. Jewish diaspora may pop up on the quiz. And the Jewish diaspora is just that. It's a dispersion. It's throwing the dandelion seeds to the wind. A scattering of Jewish people occurs at this juncture in history to all points anywhere else on planet Earth, just not in their historic homeland because the Romans didn't want them there, and we're going to continue to persecute them. Everybody with me so far? Have I offended anybody's religious or historical sensibilities yet? If not, hang on, I'll get there. So that's where we have the dispersion of Jews into other parts of the Middle East, into even modern-day India, into modern-day Iran even, into Central Asia, mostly into modern-day Europe, or what will become modern-day Europe. So big populations of Jewish folks in all of the ancient world, in the classic Eurasian world, because of this kicking out effect of the Romans. And again, just call it the 1st century AD. It's like 70 AD. 70 AD to 130 AD under multiple waves of kicking them out. Okay, that then sets the stage for, okay, I got it, Boyer. There were Jewish people in this historic area that they claimed for 1 to 2 to 3,000 years. Check. Now I understand why they left, because they had to. Check. Thanks, Romans. And thus sets the stage for the problems we have today. Because once the Jews left their historic heritage homeland, it's not like it was sitting empty. New tenants moved in, and I've now referenced this already, that around 600 AD, this is 500 years later, give or take 100 years, you have the rise of another religion called Islam. Actually, in the interim, you had the rise of Christianity that was occurring at the same time the Jews were getting ejected. Then you also have the rise of Islam in the area, and the rise of the Arab Empire, which I've now told you went around the Eastern Med, displaced the Roman Empire, succeeded by the Ottoman Empire in 1300, which maintained most of the territorial control of the Arab Empire, and with the same religious affinity. And then, of course, to play out the rest of modern affairs, getting very close to modern times now, when a lot of this stuff really starts to take root, you have the Ottoman Empire, which sadly aligns with Germany during World War I and immediately loses. And so the victorious European powers decide to carve up the Ottoman Empire. So this once mighty empire that had been around for 600 years, 600, 700 years, was kind of washed away and taken over by the Europeans, and particularly in something that we call the mandate system. So after they kick out the Ottomans and the Turkish folks, the Turkish Ottoman survivors basically, got all the rest of their empire taken away from them, and they're left with Turkey. So Turkey is the byproduct of the former Ottoman Empire, where the Turkish people are. So far, so good. However, with the rest of the pieces of the Ottoman Empire that were carved up by the Europeans, they selectively took over parts of it. They said, well, Saudi Arabia, you kind of been around for a long time, and you're the historic birthplace of Islam, so we don't want to mess with you, so we're going to allow you to be independent. However, most of these other countries, because the Europeans are really great at taking over other parts of the world, the Europeans said, well, how about this? Well, Britain said, well, we're going to take this place and carve it out and call it Egypt. And you can see from this map, the French carved out a piece and said, we're going to call this Syria. And this is under our mandate. So the French ended up controlling large swaths of West Africa. You see Algeria, Morocco, Niger, Chad, and Syria. That was the French. They didn't outright absorb them and say, by the way, you're currently part of France now. They didn't, no, it wasn't that. It was more they said, well, we're the overseers of these territories under this thing called the mandate system. And under the mandate system, you'll probably need to know that for this quiz as well. The mandate system was kind of an international peace treaty brokered thing that said, look, Great Britain, you're not going to take over Egypt and absorb it. You're going to oversee Egypt until it gets on its feet enough to become a sovereign state. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, meaning that the European powers were going to take over and exploit all this area for as much as they could until they didn't want it anymore, and then they would allow it to become independent. So the French had the mandate over Syria, the Brit and lots of West Africa. The Italians got Libya. Wow, that worked out well for all parties involved. And then the British, as you now see, had huge sections of different mandates in the classic Middle East, including the Arabian Peninsula. And I would be hesitant, or I'm not hesitant to point out that look what parts of the Arabian Peninsula that the British had mandates over. Oh, I don't know, all of the GCC. So all of those Gulf countries, including the UAE, Oman, Yemen, what's now Iraq, what's now Jordan, what's now Egypt, what's now Sudan. All of these were British mandates. And again, it wasn't outright ownership. It was pretty much like, well, these countries, these pseudo countries can't rule themselves, So you big boy European countries should be their daddy and take care of them until such time that they become a sovereign state. There was never any real intent by these European powers to push these countries to become sovereign. They were just taking advantage of the situation and exploiting things as best they could. Okay, and for not just exploiting resources, but for political gain. You want to take this territory over so that your competitor won't take it over. And maybe we're going to take over Iraq and these other areas so that Russia doesn't come in and get them. So you have a lot of political wrangling too. I would also point out that, there's a civil war still happening in Syria. Part of that is because the French had the mandate over that, and it became a different ruling system and was treated differently than, say, Iraq and Jordan right next door. That's part of the conflicts within the Middle East. Started here with the mandate system. Okay, now what's that got to do with our story of the UAE recognizing Israel? Because Israel, or the country that would become Israel, was called Palestine at the time. Remember, we now are looking at a couple thousand years where Jews had not been living in their historic homeland, and other folks had been living in that historic homeland, and they became known as the Palestinians, mostly Arab ethnicity, mostly followers of Islam. For a couple thousand years, they're hanging out there. However, when all of this goes down post-World War I, after the Ottoman Empire crumbles, they carved out this place called Palestine and gave that mandate to the British, much the same way the British got Jordan and Iraq. Starting to see where this train is headed to. I hope so, because at the same time all of this is happening, there's this movement called Zionism that's popping up. And Zionism was an international movement by Jews in other countries. Remember, they're not back yet. They have been dispersed to Europe. And then, of course, in the interim, the New World is discovered. So lots of Jews end up in the New World and in America. So it's a worldwide political movement to reestablish the Jewish homeland by those dispersed for thousands of years. And it mostly was in London. By the way, you might have heard this term Zion before. I think there's a Mount Zion that's important to biblical literature. But you might have heard of even Zion in the Matrix movies. There's the home city is called Zion, the last human city deep in the earth. So the Zion movement, the followers of the movement are Zionists. They're saying, hey, this was our historic homeland given to us by our God a few thousand years ago. We would like to have that back now. Thank you very much. And through political movements, especially in Great Britain, but even in America and other European countries, this started to gain some leverage. Some politicians were receptive to this. They're like, oh, well, we have the Judeo-Christian moral and ethical kind of togetherness. Judaism is what gave birth to Christianity. And we have the Old Testament, which is the Jewish thing, and the New Testament, which is the Christian thing, even our book together, the Bible. So there was this cultural, religious affinity by a lot of Christian leaders to say, well, we feel kind of sorry for the Jewish folks who have lost their homeland. And, sure, I'll sign a petition for you to get that homeland back. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, the British have the mandate over this territory. Is this starting to ring bells now? So, pre-collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Zionist movement may have been saying, hey, we'd like to have our territory back, but it's part of a big empire, and nobody's going to go in there and fight the Ottoman Empire just to give the Jews a little sliver of land back. However, after the Ottoman Empire collapses, all of a sudden, the British are in charge of this. The British control this territory. So the Zionists are like, hey, Great Britain, guess what we'd like to have? And that's where a lot of the political wrangling occurs, and again, some sympathetic ears in the British government. And then you compound this political movement that was starting to gain success, and you already had Jews moving back to what's now Palestine/Israel on their own accord. You started to have Jewish settlements start to pop back up in what's then Palestine. And then you have this whole World War II thing, which we won't get into any detail here, but I think you've probably heard of the Jewish Holocaust. So now you have increased incentive for Jews to move the hell out of Europe to get back to a homeland they feel secure in. And after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed to the world, you had many more sympathetic ears saying, oh my gosh, holy crap, this is the most horrible thing ever. Yeah, we probably should help get this homeland back to these people who have been persecuted, holy smokes, for thousands of years. The Romans kicked the crap out of them, and then they're put in concentration camps 2,000 years after that. We should help get the Jewish homeland restored. Again, these are not my personal philosophies. I'm saying it gained traction during World War II, post-World War II. And again, the British still controlled the mandate over the territory. So a lot more Jews post-World War II started to move back to this area. You start to have clashes because, again, there's people there called Palestinians who are saying, what the hell is going on here? There's a whole bunch of Jewish people arriving in boats and setting up camps here, and damn these foreigners. See, everybody makes fun of immigrants at every given stage of human history. If a group of people are moving into your territory, you're going to be pissed off about it. So we complain about all the immigration issues today, like, oh my God, all these people are coming to Europe and it's terrible. Well, the Palestinians are saying, who the hell are all these people coming from Europe and invading our area and our territory and our homeland for the last couple thousand years? That's where it sat. So by 1947, and now we're 2 years after the end of World War II, it is also the year the United Nations was created. Shocker! Feels like a test question. 1947, United Nations. Maybe it's 46. Let's call 46, 47. The United Nations was created that put into play that countries, sovereign states could get together to put forward a plan to get the the Jewish people their historic homeland back, because the British in 1947 were like, holy shit, we don't want to be in charge of this area anymore. It's becoming a hot button issue. There's all these Jewish folks arriving, and there's lots of angry Palestinians there, and they're clashing with each other, and the British are like, what the hell? How the hell did we get in charge of this? We're getting the hell out of Dodge. So the British were one of the first to say, yeah, we support an Israeli homeland for the Jews, and we want this to go to the United Nations so we can wash our hands of the affair, quite frankly. I speak bluntly. So, there were many motivations for the British to say, let's let the world decide so that we don't so we don't get blamed and we can leave. Okay, so here's a map, look closely at this, of the original 1947 United Nations Partition Plan, before it was actually voted on. Okay, they said, okay, there's a bunch of Jewish people here, there's a bunch of Arab people who were already here for the last couple thousand years. Let's just have it. Let's split it up. Orange areas, let's make that the Judaic state. The yellow areas, we'll leave that as a Palestinian Arab state. Is that cool? And Jerusalem, the kind of capital city, will cut it in half. Or actually, it will be UN administered. So, 1947, the then fledgling United Nations came together to vote on this bill. The United States was one of the first, it was pushing, the U.S. president at the time was pushing for this bill to get passed through the United Nations. When it was voted on, all Arab states declined. They vetoed the vote. They said, we're not even showing up. We don't care. They protested in its entirety, the whole process. And as a result of that, I think, or at least partly as a result of that, the plan passed. So it was said, okay, 1947, the plan has been passed. There were abstainers. There were people that protested about the vote in itself, but it narrowly got enough votes on the global stage to have this plan passed, this two-state solution passed. Okay? In 1940, this was supposed to be enacted in 1948. It would become official. Israel would become a state, and there'd be this other state called Palestine. When this occurred, the day that Israel declared independence, and it was one day before they were officially supposed to declare independence, Israel knew that there were forces in play on the ground, military forces. So actually, the day before the bill was supposed to be enacted and Israel was going to become a sovereign state, it unilaterally declared independence, and 1 second later, all of the Arab countries around it attacked. All right? So now I got a war. On the day Israel was born, there's a war breakout about the state of Israel. All right? The repercussions of which, and I know I'm already well over time, so if you all have to go about your normal lives, by all means. I was only going to go for an hour, but I'm having too much fun. So I'm going to push on, if that's okay with you all. The repercussions of this war were that pretty much Israel, what now is called Israel, won. The Israeli forces were better funded, had better technology, and they not only repelled all the Arab invading forces, who were trying to basically just decimate the country before it became legitimate, but they didn't just repel them, but they repelled them and took over the entire area that we now look at as the state of Israel and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So you see in this map here, the orange was supposed to be the original Israeli state. I'm sorry, the orange was supposed to be the original Arab state. The green was supposed to be the original Jewish state. But by the end of this, Israeli forces controlled on the ground all of it. They controlled it all. And there was, after a couple years of war, which we all love, there was finally an armistice where all sides were exhausted and they were going nowhere. So what you're seeing now is the 1949 armistice line of what was left at the aftermath of this conflict at the birth of the state of Israel, is that there's two entities, one called the West Bank, one called the Gaza Strip, that all of the Arab folks were in, and then the Jewish folks controlled all of the rest of what's now the modern state of Israel. During this horrific war, 750,000 Palestinian refugees fled, because people do tend to flee a war zone. 750,000, almost a million Palestinian refugees got the hell out of Dodge, either went to the West Bank, Gaza Strip, or next door to Jordan, or next door to Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula. There were 10,000 Jewish refugees which fled from the West Bank and or Gaza Strip into what's now Israel. Jordan ended up controlling the West Bank, and Egypt controlled that little area called the Gaza Strip, because this remnant now of the state of Palestine didn't really even have a government during all of this. It was still a fledgling state itself, and certainly after 2 years of war, no one was really in charge. So Jordan controls what's now the West Bank, or did. Egypt controlled what's now the Gaza Strip, and Israel assumed control over 60% of the original land agreement from that 1947 UN-sponsored bill that the world agreed to, even though all the Arab states boycotted it. Okay, that's how we got to that, all right? But the story's not finished yet. This is a map that largely looks like the map of today's world. Okay, and it really sets the stage for everyone is pissed off about everything. So even though Israel won the war, they still didn't feel that secure. And there are lots of folks who said, well, we should just go ahead and take over the rest of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, get it over with, and take back our full historic homeland, what we want to claim. Obviously, all the surrounding Arab states are furious because they lost. And there's 1 million or so refugees caught in the middle of all this who are pissed off and are trying to figure out where the hell they can live and what's going to be the future, all right? Thus, you're looking at the next big thing, that because no one was happy, obviously, we're going to have another war. And that was the 6 Days War of 1967. By the way, I know I'm giving you perhaps way more detail than you wanted for a Friday afternoon happy hour that I was just talking about, the UAE Recognizing Israel. I'm skipping over 99% of the history here. I'm highlighting. There's many wars and many things I'm not going to talk about. I'm highlighting things so that you territorially understand what's happening here. Okay? So the 6 Days War of 1967 is the next big one to consider if you want to understand the situation. And that is that, excuse me, I'm still not entirely sure who started this one, but Israel at that point understood that there was probably going to be another war. Again, there were troop movements that suggested that the surrounding Arab states might attack again. There was a lot of Arab nationalism, a lot of Arab pride, especially from the leaders of Egypt and Jordan at the time, who were suggesting, hey, we need to go back to the old lines from the original UN agreement. Both Egypt and Jordan were housing hundreds of thousands of refugees for now decades. So they had a vested interest in solving this issue as well. There was tension, and the tension was ramping up because there were powerful leaders in all the countries, including Israel. And so my understanding of it is that Israel did a basic preemptive attack during the 6 Days War, and it is so named because, indeed, it lasted 6 days. So Israel attacked some targets, particularly the Egyptian Air Force, decimated it, took all the Egyptian Air Force out in like an hour. So Israel had dominated the skies of then this whole historic classic Middle East area. And because Jordan and Egypt had a military agreement, Jordan had to attack. And so because Israel attacked Egypt, Jordan was pulled in because they were allies with Egypt. In fact, they were one country called, I think, Greater United Arabia or something like that. It didn't last long. So Israel, at the end of this, and I'm jumping ahead, skipping a lot of details, Israel won this big time. So it was frowned upon by many in the international community. They're like, dude, what did you guys do? It's just tense enough here, and you just attacked all your neighbors and took over a bunch of territory. So write everything I say down on this slide. Because of the 6 Days War of 1967, Israel takes over the entire Sinai Peninsula, which was not even a classic part of historic Israel. That's Egyptian territory. It occupies the Golan Heights, a region of what's now Syria. In fact, it was Syria back then. Israel, to this day, still controls the Golan Heights in a neighboring sovereign state called Syria. Israel takes fully over and occupies those other areas called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which was the remnants of Palestine that were at the time controlled by Jordan and Israel. I keep mixing them up. West Bank and Gaza Strip were controlled by Jordan and Egypt. So the result of this war is Israel takes over everything, and then some. Takes over the full classic historic homeland, as well as the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. This sets the stage for another war in 1973, but I'm going to skip over that because nothing really changes. I just want you to look at this before and after the 67 war. So before, you see what all Israel controlled and was recognized at that point as the State of Israel. The West Bank and Gaza Strip were still supposed to be Palestine. And after this war, Israel controlled all of it. Didn't absorb it all, but controlled all of it, and even more, especially that Sinai Peninsula. That's important for you to understand because here we go. Here's another test question. This is how we get the first Arab state to actually recognize the State of Israel. And it's not the UAE. The UAE, just 3 weeks ago, became the third Arab state to recognize Israel. The first was actually Egypt, because the embarrassment incurred by this huge failure of a war, the 1967 war, where Egypt gets just annihilated, and so does Jordan. It's embarrassing to them. And Egypt lost the entire Sinai Peninsula, and they weren't powerful enough to take it back. So they wanted to negotiate it back. So Egypt, under a different ruler, I believe his name is Anwar Sadat, but I'm not going to test you on that. He makes strides towards normalizing relations and says, hey, here's the deal. If you guys give us back the Sinai Peninsula, we'll recognize you. We'll recognize it. We just want the Sinai back. Because this is in 1979. This is a full decade after this war, and there was another war, the Yom Kippur War in 73. Nothing really changed. Every time there was any sort of movement to try to regain territories, the Israeli armed forces repelled them. So they felt like we got to negotiate our peninsula back, and they did. So Egypt actually becomes the first state to officially recognize the existence of the State of Israel and normalize diplomatic relations. Jordan follows suit a couple decades later, and probably they did it because they were still housing, and I think they still are, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, and so they wanted a little bit of a normalization so that they can work on what do we do with these now second, third, fourth generation Palestinians who are living in Jordan. They're not even citizens. They've been living here since 1947. And if we normalize relations, maybe we can get things back to normal. And it was also part of, hey, Israel, if we normalize relations with you, how about we do something called the two-state solution, which is you, Israel, will officially give back the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians, who are still hanging out there, but they're not really in control because Israel occupies those territories, and it still does. So you can't really be a sovereign state called Palestine, if another state actually controls your whole territory. So in a hoped quid pro quo, both Egypt and Jordan recognized in order to get strategic things done for themselves. It still remained, though, that even to this day, Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza Strip are still administered, controlled by the State of Israel, and there's not a whole lot left. And over the years, what's been Palestinian territory that, again, in 1947 was supposed to be a sovereign state, and then after the first war they lost a bunch of that territory, and it's been slowly whittled away year after year after year. So what you see on this map is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and these are basically points of control, meaning the blue dots are either, let me go back, the blue dots are either Israeli checkpoints or Israeli settlements. So slowly over the years, the Israeli government has on again, off again, encouraged Jewish people from the State of Israel to go over into the West Bank or the Gaza Strip to build settlements. Maybe you've heard that, the settlements issue, to basically build Jewish subdivisions, to buy land that then becomes Jewish-owned land, and then those settlements want the Israeli government to recognize them. So it's kind of a piecemeal kind of, one can look at the whole thing and say, well, it looks like you're just slowly taking over these Palestinian Arab lands, sometimes by buying them, sometimes by putting strategic checkpoints or military bases on them. And it is hard to see how that's not the case. And this is, by the way, the stuff I'm saying now, this is when you start to piss off people who are really pro-Israel and will say, oh, you're anti-Semitic, or you hate Jews, or you hate, you're wrong. And it's like, well, okay, well, I just usually kind of show maps, because these are all maps that are agreed to on the international community. And you see a map like this of Palestinian or joint control is what's in the orange. The gray is under full Israeli control. This is just the West Bank. Jerusalem itself has now been fully taken over, even though it was a split city at one time, has been fully taken over by the Israeli government, or just say the State of Israel. There are strategic walls that have been built by the Israeli government to either keep people in or keep people out. So to suggest that, oh no, everything's fine, the West Bank is Palestine, it's like, no, it really isn't. And no one's really going to argue that point anymore, I don't think. Even the most devout Jewish people who would want to argue that this is their historic homeland and they should have it back. Well, that's fine, you can argue that, but don't argue that this is going to be a Palestinian territory, or that it even is a Palestinian controlled territory right this second. That brings up the last thing I want you to know for now, which is the two-state solution. Ever since the mid-70s, there were UN resolutions passed that said, hey, dudes, can you guys stop the war? Because, by the way, I've skipped over a bunch of wars, and I've skipped over a bunch of Palestinian uprisings, and I've skipped over a whole bunch of conflict and death and turmoil and suffering within the State of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I've skipped over a bunch. But needless to say, it's never been happy. And so in the 70s, the UN passed a resolution saying, hey, why don't we have this thing called the two-state solution? We can argue about the borders, but why don't we get back to our 1947 agreement and you guys give up and give sovereign territorial control to this place called the West Bank and Gaza Strip and call that Palestine. And the rest you can call the state of Israel. That's why it's two-state solution. Right now, there's just one state that kind of controls this other territory. That's the two-state solution. This is the solution that people have, and politicians and leaders for decades have been trying to push through. Decades. We are going on 50 years now since this push to have two states. 50 years! And it's no closer now than it ever was. Part of the way that states have tried to pressure Israel into accepting the two-state solution is recognition. And now we're getting back to the news story. Arab states have said for decades, if you recognize Palestine and you allow the two-state solution to play itself out, and again, they don't even agree on the borders. So a lot of Arab states say, no, the borders need to go back to the 1947 UN partition plan. And others say, no, that's never going to happen. Let's just call it what remains of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That'll be a state. So there's arguments about that, okay? Side note, there's arguments within Israel. I am, speaking generally. I'm giving you the big picture. I'm not suggesting that any of these entities are monoliths. I love that word, monolith. The Israeli people all do not want to absorb the West Bank. And the Israeli people, not all of them, want to go back to the 1947 partition plan. And not all of the Israeli people want to do anything. It's a debate within the society itself. So there are pro-two-state solution Israelis, and there are anti-two-state solution Israelis. At this point, it seems like the anti-two-state solution folks are winning the political discourse because they say, well, it's all ours and we control it anyway, and it's a product of war, and we won the wars, and why are we even talking about this? So you can argue either side or multiple sides. I just want you to understand the arguments. And that's where it all sits. And if you look at a series of maps of Palestinian-controlled lands over the course of the last now 70 years, you can start to, and this is where you're going to think I'm empathizing or I'm sympathizing with the Palestinians. I'm not. I do on a personal note, but to understand the angst in this area between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and therefore the angst and anger between the Arab world and Israel, one needs just look at this series of maps. Now, this isn't propaganda, it's just maps, and they're verified, and this is the way it is. So you can like it, you can hate it, you can use it for propaganda one way or the other, you can call me all the names in the world you want, but one can empathize, not sympathize, with the plight of the Palestinians and the surrounding countries, and it's easy to understand why this has been a 50 to 70 year long source of conflict within the state and within the region. And I'm going to skip through this. That brings us back to the start. Oh, it's only been an hour and a half. This has been a delightful lecture for me. Question in the chat before we bring it all back and finish up.
What's Netanyahu's and the kids' stance on that stuff?
The kids? Who's the kid?
Likud.
Oh, Likud.
Like
kids.
I don't know, sorry.
Likud is a political party. I believe Likud is Netanyahu's political party. I believe it's fairly right-wing. I'm not going to go so far as to say extreme right-wing, but it is certainly ultra-conservative right-wing political party. If I'm thinking of it, just go Google Likud and tell me if it's Benjamin Netanyahu's party. And so, yes, Benjamin Netanyahu is the current prime minister of Israel and has been prime minister in the past, like decades ago. He is a big pro take-it-all-over guy. Now, he's a savvy political player, so he has never suggested outright, I don't think, that we're just going to take over the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We're just going to call it Israel. We don't care. And we're not going to repatriate anybody, and we're not giving money to any of the Palestinians. And by the way, there are still tons of Palestinians who live in Israel proper that I'm not sure have a vote in that democracy. So there's problems with Palestinians in the state of Israel, and there are problems with the Palestinians who are in these territories called the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which don't necessarily control their own government or their own future either. So Netanyahu has never come out, and none of his predecessors, I don't believe either, have ever come out outright and said, we're just taking it all over and we don't care. I've never heard anybody suggest that publicly. But if you look at the moves that the Israeli government has been making under Netanyahu, one can certainly make the assumption that the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu personally favor that path. They favor just kind of slowly rolling up the West Bank and Gaza Strip into Israel proper, and just calling it a day, and it's one state, and that's that. By the way, that is a suggestion by some. It's a suggestion by some Palestinians, by the way. Some Palestinians have said, forget the two-state solution, just make us Israeli citizens and give us a fair shake. But that's not happening either, at least not to my knowledge. So that's where that all stands. And now we can bring it back to the current event. And perhaps you understand why now it's kind of a really big deal. I do have to tell you, I love making fun of Donald Trump as much as the next guy, but in my defense, I've loved making fun of every president. Donnie's just a little easier because of the outlandish stuff he does. And so I'm no huge supporter. In fact, I kind of stay out of the American political system altogether. I'm like, hey, I focus on the world and I try to teach people, so I'm not getting involved in domestic politics. And so I don't want this to be interpreted as me supporting Donald Trump. But this kind of is a big deal. Now, again, whether he brokered it or he should get credit, that's up to you to decide. But the fact that it happened under his watch is significant. And it is the first actual movement of anything, positive or negative, in the Israeli-Palestinian situation for decades. I already told you, there's only two other recognizers. Egypt in 1979, test question. Jordan in 1994, test question. And now the UAE, not since 1994 had there been any political gains on either side. And so whether you like Donald Trump, hate Donald Trump, like Palestine, I hate Palestine, like Israel, hate Israel, it doesn't matter. This is a big deal because it is a catalyst for change. It is change in and of itself, and it likely will be a catalyst for future change. So while every single U.S. president forever has tried to foster peace in the Middle East, specifically by trying to foster a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian mess, none of them have really done that much. They certainly have not met with much success. The Egypt and Jordan things were kind of the last big milestones of U.S. foreign policy that even helped out in any way whatsoever. And again, that's a loaded way to say it. I say helped out. Helped out who? It depends on what side of the issue you're on. I'm just saying it doesn't matter what side you're on. This is an important event because there's only a few other important events in the last 30 years that have had any play whatsoever in this intractable solution. So normalization of diplomatic ties between another Arab state hasn't happened for 25, 30 years. And it suggests that other Arab states are now receptive to perhaps recognizing Israel. And the question I always ask is, okay, why did this happen right now? And I don't think it's too much a stretch of the imagination to understand that this happened right now for political reasons. The UAE did not wake up, 4 weeks ago and said, you know what, we should recognize Israel today. That's not how these things work. And apparently the Trump administration was trying to broker a deal behind the scenes, because as I started this intro to this podcast an hour and a half ago, I had suggested this is not that surprising. The UAE had informal relations with Israel already. they did have some things going on behind the scenes, some transfer of economic stuff and technology and information sharing. That's been happening for years. For a whole nother list of reasons, that's a different podcast. Why all of a sudden, 2 months before a U.S. election, would we be seeing the UAE come out with this big proclamation? I think I just answered myself, because it's 2 months before a major U.S. election. You already know everything about Donald Trump. Everyone on planet Earth knows everything about Donald Trump. Even if you're trying to ignore Donald Trump, you know everything about what's going on in the U.S. election. He needs a win. He needs, some positive checks. He needs to be seen as the broker, as the power broker he's claimed to be. They've not had much success. The Trump administration has not had that much success, to be blunt, on the international stage. There were all these hopes of North Korea and this and that and the other, and it's hard for me as an analyst to step back and say that the world is that U.S. foreign policy has made the world better in the last 4 years, or that it's made the U.S. stronger in the last 4 years. So they needed a win in this column to make him look more presidential. And I think if the American public understood this issue more, he might have gotten it. It will be brought up in all the debates and everything that's going to happen in the next 2 months. It will be brought up. It also plays to Donald Trump's support base of super conservative religious Americans who have this natural affinity for Israel and want to support Israel. So it does help cement his base. It's a big win for Israeli supporters in the Christian right who really love Israel. Okay, so that is the Donald Trump part of why this happened right now. But for those of you that don't follow Middle Eastern affairs, and why would you? They're complicated. Benjamin Netanyahu is being prosecuted for no less than 3 corruption scandals. He's already been thrown out of the government once or twice in the last year. They've had to dissolve the government and re-vote. So he has been in a political fight of his life in the last couple years as well. So this is a huge feather in his cap, and it cements support of the extreme right, the far right, the conservative, Judaic groups. They all love him, and that helps him. And as soon as this story broke, it also came out that, the UAE may actually be getting a shit ton of F-35s from the United States government. In other words, there's perhaps a sweetener on the deal was a bunch of arms weapons sales to the UAE, who has been establishing itself as a very independent player in the Arabian Peninsula and open to international business and open to a lot of things. In fact, one of the few places you can travel to on planet Earth right this second is the UAE. I think they're still taking all comers, even though COVID. They're like, nope, if you got enough money, you can come hang out in the UAE. So the UAE is like a little jewel, super rich country of super high technology and a big motivation to be part of the international world, the international markets, and they are on their way. So that's perhaps, this is a bit of speculation, but that's perhaps why this deal just popped up on everybody's radar 3 weeks ago. There are no coincidences in these things. All the parties stood to benefit, and benefit they have, even if most people around America don't understand really what the hell is going on. Kind of the losers of this, hopefully if you stayed with me for 90 minutes, you understand that the major repercussions for this are that this could be the end of the two-state solution. It was one of the leverages of power that the Arab League and these other states who don't recognize Israel, it was a lever of power that they were pushing Israel to do the two-state solution. So every member state, every sovereign state who flips and recognizes Israel is less power of that lever to try to force Israel into recognizing an independent sovereign Palestine. So I'm not, I don't like to be pessimistic, but I'm not wildly optimistic about the future of the two-state solution right now. It looks like with the loss of territory of the Palestinians and loss of control over the territories that they even have, And now you've got a state flipping to recognition, and it's likely going to lead to a couple other states recognizing Israel. If Benjamin Netanyahu survives the political turmoil he's currently under, if Donald Trump wins the upcoming election, and Benjamin Netanyahu survives his coming election, I think you have to be realistic and say that the two-state solution is probably not going to happen anymore, and that newer plans about absorption of Palestinians within Israel proper, but granting them voting rights and granting them citizenship rights, is probably a plan that will start to be projected out by other players. And that led me back to the story I told you at the beginning of the Arab League itself rejected the Palestinian demand to condemn the recognition that UAE gave to Israel. So the Palestinians are like, okay, well, there's not much else we can do now. They have their power in this situation has been further diminished, and other Arab countries most likely to recognize Israel. It could be none. Again, if Netanyahu loses and a more left-leaning political leader gets in charge of Israel, and if Donald Trump loses, Joe Biden would certainly have a much different foreign policy on this issue than the Trump administration. So this is how elections affect shit on the ground. It really depends on who's winning these elections that is going to decide the fate of the Palestinians, and maybe right soon, because other countries that may recognize are Oman, which is right next door, and already kind of like the UAE in terms of its status and its economy, and it's already covertly doing things with Israel. And as far afield as Morocco. Morocco is a very kind of liberal Islamic state. It's not an Islamic state. It's a monarchy, but a mostly Islamic population. But they tend to side up with Western powers, and if Oman recognizes, Morocco will be pressured by the U.S. And perhaps even some European powers to recognize Israel as well. And you could see how Bahrain, right next door, might also go this route. And so you can see how this could become a domino thing fairly quickly, or not. And I do want to end, by the way, you could see Oman and Bahrain and Morocco recognize Israel. Recognize the sovereignty of Israel. But you could not. I'll tell you this, ain't none of them going to do it before the next election cycle. And again, if both of the more right-wing leaders win those two elections in those two different countries, I predict you will see Oman and Morocco recognize Israel. If both those right-wing leaders lose those elections, you will not see anybody, not anytime soon, recognize Israel. That's just my prediction. Okay. And I do want to end on this, only to plant the seed of something that we started way back when, and somebody even asked me about Sunni versus Shia. And look at that. Here it is. I mentally projected someone would ask me that question. The other thing that's at play here is power plays within the greater Middle East. So yes, you now understand the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and perhaps now you understand why the UAE just recognized them. But that's not the only thing at play, and there are major power competitions between big entities. And the main one that I want to close on is, yes, Turkey is a major power player that vies for control and influence in different parts of the Middle East. I call them Team Arab. The Arab countries are a major power player that, under the Arab League umbrella, tries to vie for power and influence across the Middle East. And Iran, the Persian ethnic group, the Shia, a religious grouping of Iran, is the third big power player vying for control and influence across the Middle East. And Team Arab hates Team Iran. Team Iran hates Team Arab. Team Israel hates Team Iran. Team Iran hates Team Israel. So what we're seeing, this is big picture stepping it back, is that part of the UAE, and perhaps Oman and Bahrain, recognizing Israel, is also to counter the influence of Iran, which both Israel and the Arab states don't like. So a common dislike, a common enemy, that being Iran, may also be part of the reason that some other Arab states are now starting to partner with Israel. And that's all I got for you today. If you'd like to know way more about that and the Shia Crescent I've got up here, I think, Katie, you made that diagram way back when.
Maybe go to big screen.
Oh, how do I go to big screen? Oh, me come back to big screen? Oh, yeah. I think I know how to do that. I did it, I think. So if you want to know more about that issue, that could be a whole nother lecture series. If we cover the Middle East, I actually haven't even looked at the vote of what class voted to hear about for the rest of the semester. So I need to check that out. That would certainly be part of a Middle Eastern lecture series. If you just want me to talk about Iran at some point, because they're always in the news, I can do that. The friction between Team Arab and Team Iran, I can always talk about that. Someone suggested that perhaps next week we talk about the border conflicts between India and China. That has potential to be explosive. So if there's anything else going on in the news that you would like to talk about, by all means, hit me up, vote it up, and we'll see if I can crank out something like this next week. By the way, thank you all for sticking around for an hour and a half. I was intending this to be just an hour. This particular news story I knew was going to go long because it's complicated. And now you know why it's complicated. When we do ones in the future, I will push it to be closer to 45 minutes. So this was a little abnormal. And I didn't do a podcast last week, so I doubled down and did a double podcast today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I didn't receive, are there any questions that anybody has about anything I've covered, about relations between the two, or any minutia of stuff that I've talked about? Again, hopefully, someone says Saints 0508, Brain just followed UAE and recognized Israel. No way. Is that in the news right this second? Alex Wake says, awesome lecture. Thank you, Professor Bory. Thank you, Alex. Wow, somebody's saying this really just happened. Let me pull up my news. Or can I not pull up the news?
Okay, we're good. No one can see it.
Well, I can't. I'm trying to, but it's not opening.
You're gonna have to.
New window. I got it. Wouldn't that be something if Bahrain recognized... Whoa, look at that. Oh, you are correct. Bam! Could this have been a more timely damn podcast? Holy Bahraini batshit. They just announced Bahrain is following suit. And Donald Trump, of course, is tweeting another historic breakthrough today. Look at that. Thanks for pointing that out. That is crazy. Wow, hopefully we're recording this. Because that actually happened as we were here talking. They must have heard me chatting it up. And again, now you understand that too. Bahrain actually is it Bahrain or Qatar? Which one is the home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet? U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters is where? Persian Gulf. It's in Bahrain. There you go. So I'm not going to end. I'm going to talk for one more second that the Bahraini one I should have actually predicted first over top of Oman. So Bahrain has just recognized as well, and that's not shocking because it's the home site of the United States Fifth Fleet, and that means that there's tremendous amount of U.S. Money there, in U.S. air bases there, and there's a tremendous amount of U.S. Influence there, and a tremendous amount of U.S. firepower there. The United States has been working with Bahrain as its headquarters for all Middle Eastern conflict, all Middle Eastern affairs goes out of Bahrain. So that is not terribly shocking to me either, only that I did not think it would happen before the election. So this story has just gotten taken up a huge notch as a huge win for Donald Trump's foreign policy, of which he didn't have much until the last few weeks. So now you're looking at what I was just saying 10 minutes ago, is you may now start to see a chain reaction of dominoes. I still think it's unlikely anybody else would jump in. I already wrongly predicted that no one would jump in before this election. But this could be kind of a big game changer too. Bahrain also is a country worried about the influence of Iran. So a double down, home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquarters for all U.S. operations in the Middle East. And that's partly because Bahrain is mistrustful of Iran's intentions, as is Saudi Arabia, as is the UAE. So the crazier things have happened, but I would say the craziest thing that could possibly occur, by the way, let me go back and say that's a test question. That's the second GCC member in 3 weeks that just recognized Israel. Shocking, or did you expect it because I just taught you about it an hour ago? Here's what would be hilariously shocking and a huge game changer for the whole Middle East is if Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel. And I'll bet the Trump administration is working triple overtime to try to make that happen. That's much more problematic because Saudi Arabia, being the birthplace and holiest center of the religion of Islam, there are a lot of Muslims that still do have a problem with the state of Israel that you now know about. And a lot of Muslims in the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia, don't like the Palestinian situation, which you now know about. So it would be, I guess anything's possible, but it would be a really hard push for the Saudi Arabian government as the kind of purveyor and protector of Islam to make that leap. But I already lost the bet that Bahrain would have went. So let's see what happens next. Thank you so much for whoever pointed that out to me in the chat room. That was fantabulous. And someone says, how am I going to remember all this? You were supposed to be taking notes. I ain't going to make this shit easy. This is learning. It's education. You got to get it up in the brain. And this is recorded so you could watch it again. Again, I'm not sure when I'll get the quiz up, but I'm going to try to get it up in the next 24 hours. But now I'm officially late for my other 3 jobs and happy hour, so I got to get the hell out of here. Hope you learned some stuff. Hope you like this stuff. If you still want me to do more of this stuff, then boom, hit me up and we'll keep doing it. Maybe more than once a week, but certainly we'll see you same bat time, same bat channel next Friday for the World in Review with a new topic. But for now, party on. Stop streaming, stop recording, or stop recording?
Stop recording.